So hi everybody. Once again, I'm from the Smithsonian Institution, and so we also closed down around the beginning of March. I guess it was the Smithsonian closed all its museums on March 14th, and we were faced with the challenge of the Cultural Rescue Initiative. We're not responsible for any collections at the Smithsonian, but we have many projects around the world to include the phases of the disaster cycle. So where we do training, we work on the international programs with ECROM, the First Aid for Cultural Heritage and Crisis course. We have several other courses that we do around the world, and we do disaster response as well, working with colleagues. We had to retool the way we did our response, and the difficulties, were things like challenging our staff to create new materials online, keeping motivated in a time where we were having to also cancel or postpone training events. The very Monday after we closed, we were supposed to start a special training for the US Army on monuments officers to protect cultural heritage in armed conflict. We had to postpone that. And then helping colleagues continue with ongoing recovery. These were all challenges that we faced. So there are a few projects that we already did that were digital, and we felt very confident in continuing those. For instance, the last several years, we've had a virtual student federal service internship program where students from across the United States are welcome to do mapping using geospatial information systems. We're mapping cultural heritage both in the United States and around the world that are prone to disasters or vulnerable to disasters. But with a special focus on inside the United States, state by state, we keep information about cultural heritage sites and their information about where they are and contact information, what types of collections, and we focus especially on museums right now because it seems like that information is not always right to hand when we want to find out how cultural heritage and museums have been impacted after disasters. And so that internship program, because it's already remote, we have weekly meetings by teleconference, and the students can continue that work no matter where they are. One of the things that did impact us was the closure of universities due to the COVID virus. We did have a few of our interns. We usually have around 20 to 30 interns at any given time. We had some who had to drop out because they had to move out of the dorms and just weren't able to continue, but many were able to continue from home. So we were able to keep that going even after the COVID times. So another way that we engage digitally in our training programs is we have our domestic training program, which is the Heritage Emergency and Response Training, or HEART. And that's always been a combination of in-person training with several follow-up webinars, because the training is only for 1 week and it's at the Smithsonian every year. We have always followed up with these groups and then combined the graduates into a network that spans across the United States. And so we continue doing the already scheduled webinars on special topics, but we're also able to add the COVID-19 response and recovery as part of the topics, but also to have a space for our participants to talk with one another about the solutions they had and better ways to continue with preparedness. Because as we all know, it's, as Darko just mentioned, just because we're in a very dire and worldwide disaster, basically a slow onset disaster of COVID-19, which then came to be a pandemic, it doesn't mean that nature stops. It doesn't mean that hurricane season will wait for you until you're ready to respond to the hurricane. The hurricane will come whether you like it or not. So we wanted to figure out ways that we could continue that conversation about preparedness even in the times of COVID. So one of the challenges that we knew our storm season here in the United States would be starting in the spring, as it always does. And we were separated, my staff, in our different, working from home situations. Luckily, the Smithsonian provided us a lot of resources to be able to work from home. And pretty quickly, we all learned how to use Zoom and Facebook Live and things like that. Well, at least I had to learn how to do it. And we were confronted pretty soon after our closure with a disaster where normally we have a program called Saving Your Famit Treasures, where we send a team after a disaster to go work in the impacted area. We work alongside the Federal Emergency Management Administration, and we provide information to the public about how to save their own family treasures after a disaster. Oftentimes those disasters involve water, so we have a kind of a prepared script, and we give these demonstrations at both museums and that are partners with us in the area, in the region, and they want to provide a public service for their museum or for their communities. And sometimes we have them at disaster recovery centers, which is where the public comes to apply for government assistance after disaster. But in April 2020, Easter weekend, we were faced with a really dire situation where we had 140 tornadoes across 10 states in the Southeast, which destroyed a lot of homes and impacted a few museums, but really the public was very heavily impacted. And we knew that we wanted to be able to provide something. And of course, we couldn't travel to those places as we normally do. So we set up a Saving Your Famit Treasures workshop that was live and online. You can watch this on the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative Facebook page if you're interested in having a look. Our colleagues really worked hard to make an experience as good as they could online. And because we recognize that just because we're in a time of COVID and we can't travel and we can't do our normal routine, it didn't mean that our responsibility to try to help our public could stop. Another thing that the pivot to digital helped us do was maintain the networks and reuse material that we already had developed. So for instance, these are my colleagues, Jesse Johnson and Brian Leone from the Smithsonian Museum Conservation Institute, and we all work together on a few different projects in Iraq. And so the idea of responding to disasters caused by armed conflict is basically what we've been doing a lot of in Iraq the past several years. And we had a we had a live symposium about this back in February. Diana Pardue was also there helping to host that event in Washington, D.C. And luckily we finished just before the COVID shutdown, but we recorded the entire symposium day with multiple speakers and panels. And we've been reusing some of that material online to maintain our presence and keep our networks healthy and alive. And also with the participation of our colleagues in these impacted areas in Iraq to help keep them connected to what we're doing. And so we had this webinar here on June 30th on Facebook Live, where you could watch a few scenes from the symposium, but also Jesse and Brian were live online. And then many of our Iraqi colleagues were joining in via Facebook and contributing that way. So as we talked about doing, sometimes you can be heavily long-term into a disaster response. One example is we're working with the Iraqi Ministry of Culture, the Mosul Museum, and the Louvre Museum with a grant from ALIF to do the long-term recovery of the Mosul Museum. Well, when colleagues couldn't work there and we couldn't get some of the expertise to be able to go to Iraq, to be able to go to Mosul, we had to kind of figure out how we can continue that. And when colleagues were basically able to return to the museum short term, we helped with continuing to stabilize the situation there until we can resume the work full time. And then keeping these networks alive, again, is really important. And I'm so grateful that we have great tools like Zoom and like Facebook Live. But the colleagues that we've trained over the years, for instance, in our Heritage Emergency and Response Training Program, are our eyes and ears out on the ground. These colleagues in the US are spread all the way across the United States, Hawaii, Alaska, everywhere. And so when we had another major disaster on the 23rd of May in Michigan, the Edenville Dam broke, and thousands and thousands of people had to be evacuated from the area. Several museums were impacted, but some of our HEART graduates who lived nearby were able to volunteer to come and help with the disaster response and recovery. And our colleague, Jared Yaks, was actually on the scene and designated to be one of the deputy incident commanders, and was able to work with the team. And you can see how they had to adjust to working with personal protection, wearing masks, taking measures. You can see they're socially distancing, etc., while they're actually doing a water damage response to their museum. So, and Jared was able to, get back in touch with the HEART network and with my colleagues in the Heritage Emergency National Task Force, and work together on figuring out some solutions. Their staff was really prepared. They had equipment and supplies on hand to be able to respond. And I think that it just demonstrates that having your networks in place ahead of time can really help dramatically in the disaster response situation where you're responding and yet you're trying to actually respond to the COVID while you have a new disaster of, for instance, a flood incident.